Hi, I'm Martin Felson. Welcome to City Design, where we explore how we shape cities and how cities shape us. This episode, Cities of the Afterlife, is the third in a series on city history. Last episode, we explored the ancient cities of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, places compressed behind thick walls, wrapped around citadels, and held together by kings and gods. Now we move forward to a civilization that built cities not just for the living, but for the dead. In ancient Egypt, cities were designed so that life could continue indefinitely. These cities merged life on Earth with the afterlife. Even today, well over half of all people believe in life after death. In ancient Egypt, belief in the afterlife was the organizing principle of entire cities. The pyramids and temples that pharaohs built ensured the afterlife was the center of urban activity. Monuments and tombs embodied Egyptian belief in the three stages of the afterlife: the underworld, eternal life, and the rebirth of the soul. This scroll, the Papyrus of Hunefer, is a book of the dead, an instruction manual that guides the deceased through the afterlife. This scene of the underworld shows the deceased Hunefer taken into the judgment hall by the jackal-headed Anubis. The next scene shows Hunefer's heart being weighed against the feather of truth. The ibis-headed Thoth, scribe of the gods, records the result. If Hunefer's heart is lighter than a feather, he is declared justified and welcomed into the afterlife. If not, he is devoured by the waiting Amit. Eternal life meant being reborn again and again, but only those who lived well were guided by the gods to Osiris to begin again. Living well meant building well. Constructing grand cities and monuments to pharaohs and gods was considered a worthy deed in this life. Doing so granted Egyptians a second life, leading to eternity. Pyramids and temples were ancient machines designed to transmit the soul to the underworld. Some were vast and elaborate. But any tomb, holding a mummified body, decorated with even a few sacred texts or illustrations, could guide a person to the afterlife. Belief in the afterlife bound Egyptians together. What did the Egyptians imagine eternity would look like? The field of reeds, a paradise of fertile land, calm waters, and endless harvests. Not a distant heaven, but an idealized version of life along the Nile, an earthly world, perfected and made permanent. These ideas, judgment after death, a God who dies and is reborn, an eternal paradise for those who live justly, would echo forward for millennia from the banks of the Nile into the foundations of Christianity. Egyptian architecture was filled with portals symbolizing the path to rebirth. Mystical gates, doors, and pylons are depicted in illustrations like the 7 gates of the House of Osiris. Funerary temples were designed with similar portals and gateways to prepare one's vital spirit for the passage between the living world and the afterlife. The Egyptians believed each person possessed multiple spiritual elements. The Ka was the life force, the Ba was the personality, and the Ak, the union of the soul, was the transfigured spirit that could live on for eternity. The pyramids and temples still standing today are embodiments of the Ka, Ba, and Ak of the Egyptian people, their life force, their personality, and their eternal spirit, collectively building cities and monuments worthy of immortality. But Egypt wasn't the only civilization to build cities for eternity. Teotihuacan was laid out along its Avenue of the Dead. China's first emperor built an underground city to accompany him into the afterlife. And in Varanasi, the boundary between life and death still shapes the city today. We'll explore these cities and more in future episodes. Time for a timeline check. Let's situate ourselves between ancient prehistory and the emergence of AI. This episode focuses on cities forming roughly between 3200 and 1100 BCE along the Nile. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted roughly 3,000 years. By comparison, only about 2,000 years have passed since it's ended. So far, Egypt outlasted everything that came after it. When we think of ancient civilization, we think of Egypt. One reason is that the Great Pyramids of Giza are the only remaining wonder of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So what made Egypt, Egypt? The Nile River. Different rivers produce different civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were erratic and shifting. So was the Mesopotamian civilization. The Nile was calm and generous, and so for much of its long history, Egyptian civilization was too. The gods reflected the difference between the 2 rivers too. Mesopotamia's chaos deity, Tiamat, brought disorder to the universe. Mesopotamian gods were dreaded because life was harsh and the afterlife offered no relief. Egypt's gods, on the other hand, offered a world so ideal that it could last forever. In Mesopotamia, farmers had to build complex canals to manage unpredictable flooding. Egyptians used a much simpler system of basin irrigation, relying on the Nile's annual flood to predictably fill canals and earthen embankments. The waters deposited rich silt, soaked the soil, and enabled extensive crops. The Nile's reliability produced something that unpredictable rivers could never match: a consistent agricultural surplus. That surplus freed thousands of workers from farming and herding and funded the most ambitious building program the ancient world had ever seen. It was also because of the Nile that Egyptian cities took their unique form. The Nile flows more or less south to north. The sun crosses the river in the perpendicular direction, east to west. These 4 cardinal points gave Egyptian cities the rectangular grid, which thereafter became a classic urban geometry. Egypt is a linear civilization, clustered along the fertile edges of the river. Move east or west away from the Nile, and the environment turns hostile. Endless desert, unrelenting sun, no farming possible. Many cities were sited on the east bank, symbolizing sunrise and life. Necropolises and funerary temples were situated on the west bank, symbolizing sunset and death. Orientation in Egypt is intuitive. You're either walking along the path of the river or walking along the path of the sun. This produced a strong preference for orthogonal architectural form, organized by 90-degree angles aligned to the cardinal axes. When we look at Egyptian art depicting life along the Nile, the illustrations and bas reliefs are rarely realistic scenes. They are abstractions organized by a gridded geometry. Here we see an Egyptian hieroglyph for city, crossing pathways within an enclosure, subdividing space into a 4-quadrant grid. A simple summary of urban life along the Nile. There is a timeless beauty in orienting cities and monuments along cardinal axes. Like when the sun aligns perfectly with an urban grid, or when Stonehenge fulfills its cosmic purpose by aligning with the solstice. During the Nile's annual flooding, all sorts of urban boundary lines would disappear. Property markers would vanish beneath the water. Because pharaohs needed to tax the land and farmers needed to reclaim their fields after a flood, surveying emerged early in Egyptian society. And with surveying tools, like this rope stretcher, came geometry, which, as Herodotus wrote, passed thence to Greece. This mathematical precision, this desire for geometric clarity, shaped most everything the Egyptians made, including hieroglyphics. This illustration shows workers sculpting a giant statue. The scaffolding acts as a grid, guiding their work. A sense of measure became a canon, a rule of geometric proportions, preserved across workforces and time. These 2 statues were made over 1,000 years apart, and yet their form is nearly identical. The Egyptian word for sculptor means he who keeps alive. And that's what Egyptian design did. It kept alive a formal language. Developing a formal language that characterizes a culture and lasts isn't easy. In architecture today, the glass box has only been around for about 100 years, and yet it still has little connection to any local context or climate. But in Egypt, for 3,000 years, a language of sculpted and stacked mass gave architecture a strong sense of permanence and place. Monuments built with firmness and wonder, designed for eternity. There were 2 kinds of cities in ancient Egypt: cities for the people and cities for the gods. In cities for the people, homes and everyday buildings were made of mud brick. Stone was reserved for temples and monuments, the cities of gods. In each of Egypt's 3 historic kingdoms, cities for gods took different shapes. The Old Kingdom was the age of the pyramids. The Pyramid of Djoser was the first. Its architect, Imhotep, revolutionized construction by building the king's tomb with stone. Before Imhotep, early Egyptian tombs, called mastabas, were flat-roofed, rectangular slabs made of mud brick. They covered underground burial chambers. The Pyramid of Djoser is a stack of mastabas, not yet a true pyramid, more like a stepped ziggurat. The Giza Plateau, near the ancient city of Memphis, became the royal city for the dead that we're all familiar with. The plateau's pyramids, temples, and mastabas were linked by processional paths. And the Great Sphinx, carved from the bedrock of the plateau itself, stands guard. The Egyptian word for pyramid was mer, believed to mean place of ascension. The pyramidal shape guided a king toward the sky to begin the next phase of existence in the afterlife. And a note about pyramid builders: no slave quarters have ever been discovered at Giza. No Egyptian records describe anything like the story of slaves in the biblical book of Exodus. Many workers' quarters have been found, all suggesting that the work at Giza was performed by a compensated workforce. Middle Kingdom temples, like the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, were designed to reenact the creation of the Egyptian universe. The thick-walled pylon gates represent the mountains on the horizon through which the sun god Ra passes daily. The floor gradually rises the further one moves inward, from an initial open courtyard through columned courts, leading to hallways and ritual chambers, giving the impression of ascending from the primeval waters up the rising riverbank. The columns in the hypostyle hall are designed to resemble lotus, papyrus, and palm plants, reflecting the marsh-like environment of the river's edge. The inner shrine enclosing the gods is restricted and dark, representing the hidden nature of the cosmos from which life began. A masterpiece of the New Kingdom is the temple at Abu Simbel. Cut from solid rock, 4 seated colossi flank the entrance, depicting Ramses II on his throne, each 65 feet tall. Beneath these colossi, smaller statues depict Ramses' conquered enemies, the Nubians, Libyans, and Hittites. Inside, the temple is engraved with Ramses and Nefertari paying homage to the gods. Abu Simbel is aligned to the east, so that twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the sun shines directly into the inner sanctum to illuminate statues of Ramses II and the god Amun. This kind of celestial alignment along the cardinal axes runs through Egyptian architecture, from pyramids to temples. By the New Kingdom, the monumentality of temples had made them targets for tomb robbers. So pharaohs moved their burials underground, into the Valley of Kings, a hidden necropolis carved deep into the limestone cliffs on the west bank of Thebes. Over 60 tombs, their corridors painted with scenes from the Book of the Dead, designed to guide the pharaoh through the underworld and into eternity. The unity that civilizations like Mesopotamia achieved through walled fortresses, Egypt achieved as a gift of nature. The Nile Valley itself had the features of a walled city. Deserts, mountains, and sea served as natural ramparts, keeping Egypt largely free from invasion for long stretches of its history. This natural security may explain why Egyptian civilization was so durable. Even after periods of social disruption, it returned to the same institutions, the same religious and political leadership it had known from the beginning. Under these conditions, the Egyptian city took a different form, more open and less walled. Memphis, the Old Kingdom capital, built few defensive walls as it built the pyramids at Saqqara and Giza. Amarna, the purpose-built city of the pharaoh Akhenaten, stretched openly between the river and desert. Thebes, the great capital of the New Kingdom, spread along both banks of the Nile, temples and palaces on the east, tombs and funerary monuments on the west, with few walls between them. And at Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of Thebes, workers and artisans lived in a planned, gridded settlement hidden by hills, building tombs for the pharaohs buried just over the ridge in the Valley of the Kings, a living city in the service of the dead. These ceremonial complexes, connected to constellations of surrounding settlements, formed open cities, unwalled but unified by creativity and purpose. Had these advantages existed everywhere, the open city might have become the dominant urban form. Two contrasting patterns of urban life emerged from two great river valleys of the ancient world. Mesopotamia, driven by self-protection, fortified itself behind heavy walls under the watchful eye of the citadel. Egypt, trusting in the Nile and the sun, rewarded community with the promise of eternal life. Neither path was entirely pure. There was coercion in Egypt and cooperation even under the most ruthless rulers in Mesopotamia. But the differences between these two ways of building cities, open or closed, have persisted, often in disguise, throughout urban history. In the next episode, we'll explore the fundamental characteristics of urban early life that would shape cities for millennia to come. Thanks for watching City Design. See you next time as we keep exploring how we shape cities and how cities shape us.